Rollback, Repealing Big Government Before the Coming Fiscal Collapse by Thomas E. Woods, Jr. Narrated by Johnny Heller. Copyright 2011 by Thomas E. Woods, Jr. This unabridged audiobook is published by arrangement with Regnery Publishing, Incorporated, and was produced in the year 2011 by Tantor Media, Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto. There is no doubt that the real destroyer of the liberties of any people is he who spreads among them bounties, donations, and largesse. Plutarch. The more corrupt the state, the more numerous the laws. Tacitus. Chapter 1. Is it already too late? Nobody trusts the government, pollsters tell us. In April 2010, the Pew Research Center found that only 22% of Americans polled said they trusted the government at least most of the time. I wish I believed it. Most Americans seem to have a childlike confidence in government. They may be skeptical of the politician who insists he's been faithful to his wife, but they buy all the major claims government makes for itself. And although they know the government's finances can be dicey, they seem to console themselves that the experts are in charge and that somehow everything will work out. Few entertain even the possibility of any sort of general collapse or default. This confidence is about to be severely shaken. A systemic crisis is poised to strike in unprepared America, as the federal government is forced to renege on its impossible promises. It will no longer be the godlike dispenser of bounties, the miracle worker that summons bread from stones. For even if, 1, the robust economic recovery Americans have been waiting for finally arrives, 2, the federal debt becomes manageable, and 3, the nearly $1 trillion in annual interest payments on that debt, a permanent part of the federal budget within 10 years, is a price Americans are willing to pay, we're still sunk. The federal entitlement programs, on which generations of Americans have been taught to rely and to base their expectations for retirement, will go bust in our lifetimes. The aging of the population guarantees it. The resources do not and will not exist to make good on these promises. Most of the people hearing this book will live through one of the most significant periods of change in American history. The scale of the coming inevitable spending cuts will be unlike anything Americans have ever experienced during peacetime. Americans have never seen federal spending scaled back. Even when the newspapers speak of budget cuts, they don't actually mean the budget will be lower than it was the previous year. They mean only that its rate of growth is falling. Government is never cut. But it will be. Between now and the entitlement collapse, our representatives in government will keep trying to kick the can down the road. They will buy time with marginal reforms in the programs involved. When that time runs out, they'll try the same thing again. With default staring them in the face, they will try tax increases. They will try borrowing. They will try printing the money. None of these approaches will work, as I intend to show, though if employed vigorously enough, they just might wreck the economy, including the dollar itself. But in crisis, there is opportunity. Former White House Chief of Staff Rahm Emanuel, who notoriously observed that a crisis should never be allowed to go to waste, was on to something. Though his meaning was clear enough that government should exploit crisis situations to ram through the laundry list of programs that would be politically prohibitive during times of calm, he arrived at the wrong conclusion. The coming fiscal crisis is an opportunity to take a careful second look at government, its claims and its promises, and to see how much of it holds up to the harsh light of reason. Forget the comic book rendition of government achievements we were all taught in 6th grade. This book paints a far different picture. And with that picture in mind, the unavoidable slashing of the federal budget that will have to take place is cast in rather a different light. instead of a regrettable exercise undertaken out of grim necessity. It will be an enormous stride forward into a much brighter future. The critical first step for checking the seemingly unstoppable federal advance is to stick a dagger through the heart of the myths by which government has secured the confidence and consent of the people. We know these myths by heart. Government acts on behalf of the public good. It keeps us safe. It protects us against monopolies. Without it, America would be populated by illiterates. Half of us would be dead from quack medicine or exploding consumer products, and the other half would lead a feudal existence under the iron fist of private firms that worked us to the bone for $1 a week. But let's suppose that the federal government has in fact been an enemy of the people's welfare, and that the progress in our living standards has occurred in spite of its efforts. It pits individuals, firms, industries, regions, races, and age groups against each other in a zero-sum game of mutual plunder. It takes credit for improvements in material conditions that we in fact owe to the private sector, while refusing to accept responsibility for the countless failures and social ills to which its own programs have given rise. Rather than bringing about the public good, whatever that means, it rules over us through a series of fiefdoms, seeking bigger budgets and more power. Despite the veneer of public interest rhetoric by which it hides its real nature, it is a mere parasite on productive activity and a net minus in the story of human welfare. Now, if this is a more accurate depiction of the federal government, and I intend to argue that it is, we are likely to have a different view of the consequences of the coming fiscal collapse. So an institution that has seized our wealth, held back the rise in our standard of living, and deceived school children into honoring it as the source of all progress will have to be cut back? What's the catch? This is no calamity to be deplored. It is an opportunity to be seized. Still another purpose of this book, therefore, is to demonstrate that we would not only survive but even flourish in the absence of countless institutions we are routinely told we could not live without. Americans have given government the benefit of the doubt because they have thoughtlessly accepted a schoolboy narrative of how much worse off we would all be without it. If the coming disaster is to be averted and future crises prevented from arising, the smiley-face version of government we learned in junior high needs to be dismantled and discarded forever. Chapter 4, for instance, spends some time discussing portions of the federal regulatory apparatus. It does so not because the regulatory agencies are themselves particularly expensive. Their indirect costs on the private sector are another matter, but because they form a significant part of the mythological edifice that gives rise to the public's naive confidence in government. In speaking of averting the coming disaster, we can't fool ourselves into believing pain can be avoided. The horse has already left the stable. The federal government has made it impossible for us to escape unscathed. The only way to prevent the outright collapse on the horizon, a collapse that would surely be followed by emergency government policies that could destroy the dollar and with it the fortunes of the people, is by making severe cuts in the present. Some of these, as this book will argue, will be easy, and in spite of the predictable caterwauling by the interest groups involved, Americans would hardly notice them. Others will be more difficult, particularly since they will need to be so substantial and sudden. The best we can hope for is to endure some pain now in order to avoid a systemic crisis later. The more we can do in the present, the less severe will be the problem in the future, and the less likely our public servants will be to wipe Americans out completely in the course of trying to overcome it. Finally, this book proposes some methods by which the expansion of federal power might be halted or reversed. Most of these approaches are unconventional, as the nature of the situation demands. Some will be derided as unrealistic, the usual complaint about suggestions that would actually work and are obviously necessary. What is truly unrealistic, on the other hand, is the long-term solvency of the federal government. A historic default is coming. Wrenching changes will have to be made to prevent it. Few people in public life dream of proposing such changes. Few Americans realize the depth of the problem. Everyone thinks it can be pushed off until tomorrow, even as midnight draws nearer. In the short run, people's lives will be disrupted, in some cases severely, and there will be much human suffering for a generous people to alleviate. But in the long run, our prospects are much brighter. When the crisis at last subsides, we will emerge with a more just and humane society. We will have learned to care for each other as families and neighbors once did. We will no longer look superstitiously to one institution to devise solutions to the problems of 309 million people. Instead of seeking subsidies taken from our fellow Americans by threats of state violence, we will have to seek wealth peacefully by discovering how we can best please our fellow man. The federal collapse will likewise yield us a far freer and more prosperous society, in place of the maze of subsidies, taxes, penalties, special privileges, and self-perpetuating bureaucracy that afflict us now. Federal bankruptcy, in short, may turn out to be one of the best things that ever happened to America. The crisis. Since at least 2006, opinion makers have belligerently commanded our assent to certain claims about the health of the American economy. According to them, in that year everything was fine. The fundamentals of the economy, including the housing market, were sound. The stock market was booming. Dissenters were incorrigible perma-bears who refused to accept good news. In 2008, their tune changed. Unless unprecedented bouts of government intervention were approved, the world was about to descend into a black hole. Dissenters were laissez-faire ideologues who hadn't learned what the talking heads claimed were the lessons of the Great Depression. By early 2009, green shoots were popping up as prosperity began to return. There was a light at the end of the tunnel. Now dissenters were perma-bears who refused to accept good news, etc. And it continues. The green shoots claim of early 2009 came from a 60 Minutes interview with Ben Bernanke, chairman of the Federal Reserve System. Soon that image was everywhere. Within months, a compliant media had taken a phrase no one had been using and made it central to discussions of the economy. A few hundred, then a few thousand articles featured it. In no time, the phrase was generating millions of Internet hits. As 2010 went by, the green shoots grew more and more farcical. Employment figures, it turned out, had been artificially stimulated by job growth in health, education, and government itself, where state and federal money, rather than consumer demand and entrepreneurial risk-taking, was the driving force. Economist Nouriel Roubini laughed at the phantom green shoots. The correct image for the economy, he said, was brown manure. The light at the end of the tunnel was an oncoming train. Whether the conventional wisdom has been right or wrong since 2006, it has studiously avoided mention of the sword of Damocles hanging over these discussions. Even if modest economic recovery were to take hold in the United States, the federal government still faces a catastrophe whose proportions in terms of the scope of the adjustments Americans will have to make in response to them will exceed those of the recent financial crisis. In a moment of unusual candor, Bernanke himself drew attention to this coming crisis in a largely overlooked speech of October 4, 2010, saying in the understatement of the year that the federal budget was on an unsustainable path. Here's what he meant. Strictly speaking, the U.S. government's debt problem amounts to $14 trillion, the amount of the national debt, the sum of the accumulated deficits of the past. But although they do not technically involve the full faith and credit of the federal government, Social Security and Medicare, programs whose assistance millions of Americans have been taught to count on, are inadequately funded to meet the obligations of the future. To get the full picture of the obligations the U.S. government is facing, we have to add the amount of this entitlement shortfall to that $14 trillion. Unfortunately, that extra amount is $111 trillion. The full future expense of these programs exceeds the total net worth of the U.S. economy. That is what people usually mean when they say the United States is bankrupt. In the early 2000s, well before the Obama deficits, commentators were warning that interest charges on the United States debt would consume half the federal budget by the mid-2030s. Today, the Congressional Budget Office projects that by 2020, just the interest payments on the national debt will reach $925 billion per year. That is actually a rosy scenario, since it assumes a robust economy and stable interest rates. If the economic picture remains grim, or if interest rates should rise, that figure will grow much larger. But these deficits, staggering as they are, do not reflect this impending problem posed by the unfunded liabilities of Social Security and Medicare. Even if the federal budget were balanced and the deficit reduced from over $1 trillion to zero, when we factor in the unfunded liabilities problem, the U.S. government would still fall further into the hole by $2 trillion to $4 trillion a year. Of the $96.5 trillion in unfunded Medicare liabilities, $19.4 trillion was added by the small government George W. Bush administration's prescription drug benefit, known as Medicare Part D. The story of that bill's passage is the story of America in the 21st century. The White House did not want to risk the bill's passage by letting accurate estimates of its cost leak out. Richard Foster, Medicare's chief actuary, reported that its administrator, Bush appointee Thomas Scully, threatened him with his job if he revealed cost estimates to Congress, a claim that email correspondence from a Scully subordinate appeared to corroborate. The pharmaceutical industry was thrilled with the bill, which would yield perhaps an additional $100 billion in industry profits over the next 8 years. 10 days after the bill's passage, Scully left to join a lobbying firm and represented several large pharmaceutical companies. The bill's principal author, Billy Tozan, went on to head the drug company's main lobbying organization, a position that paid $2.5 million per year. In 2010, the Republican Party's Pledge to America promised to cut an unspecified $100 billion from the federal budget. The major budget busters were to be kept off the table entirely. America is staring default in the face, and the boldest proposal we hear is for trimming $100 billion. That's like taking $3 off a trip to the moon. Lawrence Kotlikoff is an economist at Boston University. He is a Democrat. His establishment credentials are considerable. He estimates the fiscal gap at an astounding $200 trillion. He thinks some relatively painless reforms can fix a $200 trillion problem, but he never tells us what they are. The truth is, there are no such reforms. If there were, they would have been implemented long ago. If they were, Kotlikoff would have disclosed them to us instead of hinting at their existence and never mentioning them again. But listen to him. He is saying the sort of things people were once shouted down as alarmists for saying. We have 78 million baby boomers who, when fully retired, will collect benefits from Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid that, on average, exceed per capita GDP. The annual costs of these entitlements will total about $4 trillion in today's dollars. Yes, our economy will be bigger in 20 years, but not big enough to handle this size load year after year. This is what happens when you run a massive Ponzi scheme for 6 decades straight, taking even larger resources from the young and giving them to the old, while promising the young their eventual turn at passing the generational buck. It will all come to an end, he warns, in a very nasty manner. The first possibility is massive benefit cuts visited on the baby boomers in retirement. The second is astronomical tax increases that leave the young with little incentive to work and save. And the third is the government simply printing vast quantities of money to cover its bills? More than likely, we'll see all three. Ronald Reagan's first White House budget director, David Stockman, noted in the summer of 2010 what had been happening for the past 2 years. Nominal GDP had been rising at $4 billion per month, while federal debt had been increasing at $100 billion per month. That means the federal government has borrowed $25 for every dollar the GDP has increased. There's your big stimulus. Never in American history have we seen the federal debt grow 25 times faster than the economy itself for 2 years running. Stockman also casts a skeptical eye on the prosperity of the past several decades. Since the last vestiges of the gold standard were abandoned in 1971, and with them the remaining restraints on how much money the Federal Reserve System, discussed in Chapter 4, could create out of thin air, the economy has been taken for a ride that has looked like prosperity, but has been more like a repeatedly stimulated sugar high. It turns out, Stockman says, that there was no miracle of economic growth, productivity, and prosperity over the last several decades. What we had instead was serial bubble after bubble, fueled by a tsunami of public and private debt and printing press money. So it is an already rickety, debt-ridden economy that will have to face the coming fiscal crisis. One of the key reasons for the looming collapse is the aging of the population, a phenomenon that is taking place across the developed world. It is the result of three major factors. One, the unusually large baby boom generation that is currently proceeding through middle age. Two, falling fertility rates, which have resulted in fewer future taxpayers to make good on government's extravagant promises. Three, medical advances that have increased human longevity, operating in tandem with rising prosperity that has made possible additional spending on health. These impossible entitlement promises were built on the assumption that productivity would grow at unrealistic rates, or that ever larger hordes of new taxpayers would indefinitely continue to enter the world, rather as a chain letter depends on ever more people being added to the scheme all the time. If current birth rates in America continue, by 2040, the number of people aged 80 and over will outnumber children under age 5. This has never happened before in history. In 1970, there were 3.7 million Americans aged 80 and over, and 17.2 million under age 5. In 2040, those figures are expected to be 26.2 million and 25.0 million, respectively. In 1940, people of college age in the United States outnumbered people 65 and over, 9.6 million versus 9.0 million. By 2040, college-age Americans will have increased to 20.2 million. The number of senior citizens will have multiplied by over 7 times to 75.2 million. The retirement of the boomer generation in the United States is not simply a wrenching one-time event, difficult as that would be. It presages a future in which the elder share of the population will continue to grow until some unforeseen change compensates for it. The elder share will rise from 13 to 19% between 2010 and 2030, the years when the last of the boomers become seniors, age 65 and over. But by 2075, after the boomer generation has passed from the scene, the elder share will be an even higher 23%. Japan is feeling this demographic change the earliest and the most intensely. Life expectancy has reached 80 in Japan, and the average Japanese woman who reaches age 65 will live until 85. Extreme age is far more common than ever before. One 100-year-old Japanese woman ticketed for riding a motorcycle without a helmet explained that her 79-year-old son who was driving was wearing her helmet. Japan's cultural advantage in this situation, namely a long-standing tradition whereby the extended family cares for its members, will help see it through the country's aging crisis. But the strain on public budgets and private households will nevertheless be great. Even as the elderly population is growing, the younger population is shrinking throughout most of the Western world, and barely holding steady in the United States. Birth rates have undergone a sharp and, at least to those issuing dire warnings of overpopulation, unexpected decline throughout the West since the 1970s. Replacement level, the figure a society needs to reach in order to maintain its population without immigration, is 2.1. The U.S. fertility rate is currently 2.0. It will not be long before these demographic changes put serious strains on entitlement programs and change people's lives in drastic ways that they do not today anticipate. In 1960, there were 5.1 tax-paying workers funding each retiree. By 2030, that figure will fall to 2.2, which means every single working couple will need to support a retiree. Moreover, people over 65, but especially over 85, tend to incur disproportionately high medical bills, which an ever-shrinking base of current workers will somehow have to shoulder. Total per capita health spending for the old, 85 and older, is 3 times higher than for the young old, 65 to 84. Older Americans consume about 4 times as much in medical services as younger Americans, and 7 times as much as children. Ah, say optimists, but various government programs, including the Obama health plan, will help to bring down health costs. Such costs would have to come down quite a bit indeed in order to make possible all the additional health services demanded by a rapidly aging population. Rarely do we hear specifics regarding these alleged cost reductions or how they will come about in the absence of some form of rationing of services, as will indeed begin happening more and more around the world. Additionally, as we'll see in Chapter 2, the alleged savings from the Obama plan are an illusion. But let us suppose that these mysterious cost cuts will in fact occur. That still doesn't solve the problem, since for whatever reason Medicare's trustees have already factored cost reductions into existing projections. According to businessman and former U.S. Secretary of Commerce Pete Peterson, the official projections already build in a dramatic cost slowdown. The trustees assume that the growth in real per capita Medicare spending will decelerate from its historical rate of 5% per year to just 2% per year by the 2020s. The trustees fail to point to any change in medical technology or health status or social expectations that might account for the slowdown. The only justification they offer is that if Medicare spending did not slow down by then, it would rapidly take over our entire economy. Let us all take a collective gulp. The unsustainable official cost projections already assume tough, perhaps even draconian cost control measures that today we do not even contemplate. Intensifying the problem is that while back in 1950, when the demographics of Social Security were more sustainable than they are today, the average age at which people began collecting Social Security retirement benefits was 69. Today it is 63. And while 3 out of 5 American men in their late 60s were still working, the figure today is only 1 in 5. The aging of the rest of the world poses an additional difficulty for a U.S. government whose budget is increasingly financed by credit from foreign sources. Even in the unlikely event that the Treasury's credit rating remains perfectly strong over the long term, the challenges associated with global aging guarantee that those foreign sources are going to dry up. Savings will be needed at home and will no longer be available to buy up Treasury securities. China, in addition to wanting to finance its own industrial expansion, likewise faces an aging problem. That means much less lending to the United States. Taxing our way out of this problem, as left liberals might be inclined to propose, can't be done, even if it were desirable. It would require raising payroll taxes by as much as 350% by 2040. The Congressional Budget Office calculated that for the federal government to balance its budget while continuing on the same trajectory of expenditures, marginal income tax rates would need to skyrocket. The lowest marginal rate of 10% would have to rise to 26%. The 25% marginal rate would have to be increased to 66%. and the top rate of 35% would need to be raised all the way to 92%. This presumes that tax rates at these levels would have no negative effects on economic activity.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?